Commander, we've lost contact with Scout Unit Gamma. Lieutenant Harrow's words broke through the silence, piercing the atmosphere of the command center. Captain Sarah Malik's eyes didn't leave the view of the fleet's tactical display, even as a weight settled heavily on his chest. His mind raced, but his expression remained stone cold. The green dots representing Gamma's location on the map flickered and blinked out of existence like stars snuffed from the sky. They were gone. Soren's grip tightened around the armrest of his seat. He refused to let the wave of panic that threatened to rise show on his face. "What do you mean, lost contact?" he demanded, his voice low, steady, though the edge of concern threaded through his words. The lieutenant's face was drawn tight, her fingers dancing nervously across the console. "We don't know, sir. No distress signal." Gamma was on a routine sweep, just monitoring Caldra activity on the outer rim. "There's nothing. No signs of sabotage, no attack alerts, just nothing." The silence that followed felt oppressive. Soren inhaled sharply and leaned forward, eyes fixed on the dimmed sector on the map. This was a calculated risk. The Caldra had always been a looming threat in the distance, a shadow over human efforts to expand beyond their homeworld. And now, it seemed, the shadow had struck. "How long?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. 2 hours, Harrow responded, her fingers hovering nervously over the console. No sign of anything from their side either. No transmissions, no signals, just... She paused, taking a breath before continuing. Just static. Soren exhaled slowly. He had known this day would come. The Caldra had been systematically wiping out entire species, slowly tightening their grip on the galaxy. Earth had been preparing, but still, they hadn't expected an attack this quickly, this efficiently. Gamma was reporting from the edge of their territory, Soren muttered, more to himself than anyone else. No way they were just eliminated without reason. Something's changed. "Sir," Harrow cut in, "I think we've been compromised. This could be a trap. We need to move." "Yes," Soren said sharply, cutting her off. "Prepare the fleet. We're going in." The decision was already made, and the speed at which he made it shocked even him. But he knew, down to the marrow in his bones, that Gamma's disappearance wasn't random. The Caldra had made a statement. They had struck first, and Earth would not back down. "Helm, set course to Gamma's last known position," he barked, his voice gaining strength. "Harrow, initiate long-range scans. We need answers, now." The soft hum of the command center's engines was the only sound that followed. The crew moved quickly, preparing for what they knew could be the start of something catastrophic. Yet there was a tension in the air, thick with the unspoken truth. If they had lost Gamma, they had no way of knowing what awaited them. Soren stood, turning his back to the tactical displays. His eyes wandered over the bridge, briefly meeting the faces of the crew. He knew them all. Well, they were as close to family as he had, and they knew how to follow orders. But none of them had expected this. Not this soon. The doors to the bridge opened, and Commander Darnell walked in. He glanced quickly at the tactical display and then met Soren's gaze. "Anything new?" Darnell asked, his deep voice betraying his concern despite his composed demeanor. "Gamma's gone. No distress, no warning signals. We're heading in to investigate," Soren replied. Darnell's expression hardened. "You know this isn't just about Gamma, right? They've already taken one of our teams. They'll be waiting for us." Soren met Darnell's eyes. He had always admired the commander's pragmatism, but it was moments like this that revealed the depth of his understanding. They were no longer just chasing down an alien threat. The Caldra had made it personal. "I know," Soren replied quietly, his voice steady but tinged with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel yet. Anger. "But they won't get away with this." The fleet moved forward in formation, its engines blazing a path into the black unknown, guided by the cold light of distant stars. Soren stood by the viewports, his eyes locked on the vastness beyond. The Caldra had made their first strike. The time for hesitation was over. Hours later, Soren stood before the bridge's central command console, watching as the scanner data came in. His crew worked diligently, their fingers moving in a blur over the controls. But despite the calculations and predictions, no one spoke. They all knew the gravity of what was at stake. "Scanning complete, Captain," Herod announced, her voice tense. "No signs of Gamma, but we're picking up something strange, a series of power fluctuations just outside the main gravity well." Soren's pulse quickened. "Something's there, then. Give me a visual." The display shifted, and a blur of static turned into a jagged, flickering image. A series of Caldra warships, their sleek alien forms undulating in the black void. The ships weren't just docked in the sector. They were waiting. A cold realization spread through Soren's chest. They had been waiting for them. "Deploy all recon drones," Soren ordered, his voice calm even as the weight of the situation threatened to crush him. "Get us a closer look." The crew moved quickly, executing their orders with precision, but Soren couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment settle even heavier on his shoulders. The Caldra knew they were coming, and they had set the stage for their arrival. "Report," Soren demanded, his eyes never leaving the screen. One of the technicians looked up, his face pale. "It's too quiet, sir. There's no movement, no typical weapon signatures. They're just waiting." "Waiting for us to make the first move," Soren muttered under his breath. His mind raced. He couldn't afford to let this devolve into another waiting game. He had no intention of sitting back and letting the Caldra dictate the terms of this war. "They've made their move. Now it's ours," he said firmly, spinning toward his crew. "Prepare for combat, and find out what happened to Gamma." Soren's heart was steady, his pulse like a drumbeat in his chest. The ship shuddered as it passed the outer edge of Caldra space. The stars ahead stretched into jagged lines of light, blurring as Soren's ship, Vanguard, cut through the void, nearing the heart of enemy territory. The crew was tense, a low hum of activity emanating from the command deck. Harrow stood by the tactical console, her fingers flying across the keys, analyzing sensor data. Every few moments the tactical display blinked and shifted, showing more of the hostile territory they were now approaching. Soren stood near the viewport, his eyes narrowed at the view screen. The dark space ahead seemed too still, too quiet. It was as if the entire galaxy had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. A cold prickle of unease crept up his spine, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. They had to find out what happened to Gamma, and they had to do it fast. "Captain, we're nearing the Caldra's border zone," Harrow reported, turning from her station. "Scans show multiple ships in the vicinity, but no direct threats yet." Soren's gaze flicked to the sensor grid as the ship approached the system's edge. The usual buzz of activity, light years of calm chatter and routine traffic, was absent. A perfect quiet, the silence before a storm. "Proceed with caution," Soren said, his voice steady though his instincts screamed that they were walking into a trap. "If Gamma was taken out, there's no telling what else they've prepared for us." As they entered deeper into Caldra space, the faint shimmer of their scanners picked up something new. An odd blip, faint but insistent. Soren narrowed his eyes, stepping closer to the console. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tight. Harrow studied the readout. "I'm not sure. It looks like a distortion. Energy signatures inconsistent with what we've seen before, almost as if..." Before she could finish, the Vanguard lurched, its hull vibrating from the force of a massive shockwave. The crew's reactions were swift. The tactical displays flashed red as emergency alarms began blaring. "Shields up," Soren barked. "Return fire, full power." The ship rattled again, the violent shake sending crew members scrambling. The Vanguard bucked against a sudden barrage of energy blasts. Soren's eyes darted across the bridge, seeing his crew moving with urgency but not panicking. They had no choice but to push forward. "Captain, we've got incoming," Hera's voice came over the din. "A Caldra fleet just dropped out of FTL, right on top of us." The heads-up display flared, showing the unmistakable contours of enemy warships. Caldra ships, sleek and dark, cut through the blackness with terrifying precision. A half dozen of them, now closing in fast, their weapons charging with deadly force. Soren's pulse quickened. They had been lured here just as he feared. The Keldra were always 2 steps ahead. "Captain, the shields won't hold much longer at this rate," reported Darnell from his post. "Then we need to move," Soren ordered. "Harold, plot an evasive course. Get us behind that asteroid cluster. We're not just sitting here as targets." The ship lurched again, this time from a direct hit. The console exploded in sparks as the lights flickered, casting shadows across the crew. Harrow's fingers flew over the controls, urgently working to adjust their course. "We're being surrounded," Harrow shouted, her eyes wide. "They've anticipated every move we make." "Darnell, any suggestions?" Soren asked, his voice unwavering despite the chaos. Darnell gritted his teeth as he stared at the enemy fleet's movements. "We can't outrun them, but we can disrupt their systems. We have a few moments. If we can breach their communications and targeting systems, we can cause confusion." Soren didn't hesitate. "Do it." "Deploying secondary drones now," Darnell responded, activating the small, stealthy combat units hidden in the ship's underbelly. The drones launched, speeding toward the enemy ships like an intricate web of strategy. The first round of drone strikes went unnoticed, slipping past the Kaldra's sensor grids, but it was only a matter of time before they detected the interference. Soren didn't need to wait long. "Captain, the enemy ships are changing course," Harrow shouted. "They're adapting faster than we can handle. We need to act now." Soren gritted his teeth, his hands clenched tightly behind his back. The initial shock had worn off, replaced now by something colder, a clear determination. "Bring us into the asteroid field. I want us in the shadows. We'll fight them on our terms." The Vanguard lurched again, a direct hit sending shock waves through the ship, but this time, Soren didn't flinch. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had one advantage: their unpredictability. The ship banked hard, spiraling into the dense asteroid field with the Kaldra fleet hot on their heels. The view through the viewport shifted dramatically, revealing rocks tumbling through space, casting long, dark shadows across their path. The Vanguard twisted and spun, narrowly avoiding massive chunks of rock that hurtled toward them at unimaginable speeds. "Now," Soren commanded, his voice sharp. "Open fire. Let's make them regret underestimating us." The Vanguard unleashed a volley of weapons, the energy blasts cutting through the space debris and striking the Kaldra ships in quick succession. The Kaldra ships recoiled, but they weren't taken off guard. Their energy shields flickered back up, absorbing the hits, but Soren could see the cracks forming. "You've got their attention, Captain," Darnell said, his voice steady. "But we won't last long in this position. They've adapted." "Then we have to be faster," Soren replied, his gaze fixed on the damaged Kaldra ships, the cracks in their shields widening. He saw the opportunity. They had the enemy on the defensive. But time was running out. "Harrow, take us in closer. We're going for their lead ship." Harrow nodded, her expression hardening as she made the calculations. "Close quarters combat." Soren's lips twitched. "We don't have a choice." As the Vanguard moved in on the Kaldra flagship, the remaining drones launched one final series of attacks, disrupting the enemy's targeting systems just as the ship closed in. The Kaldra ships faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Soren's heart pounded as he watched the course adjust, closing in for the kill. "Ready all remaining missiles," he ordered. "We're ending this now." Soren's hand tightened around the armrest, his focus absolute. They were outnumbered, and the odds were shifting against them, but humanity had one thing the Keldra lacked: the will to fight when everything seemed lost. The ship jolted again, the warning lights flashing bright red. Their shields were failing. The next few seconds could decide everything. "On my mark," Soren said as the Vanguard drew nearer, its hull groaning under the strain. "Fire!" The ship's final barrage lit up the void, a streak of destruction that would send a message to the Kaldra. Humanity wasn't going down without a fight, and as the enemy flagship began to burn, Soren's resolve hardened into something even more unshakable. "Let's make them remember," he muttered, eyes locked on the enemy's dying ships. The aftermath of the battle had left Soren with no illusions about the Kaldra's strength. The enemy had superior firepower, better technology, and greater numbers. Humanity's standard tactics wouldn't work against them. Not in the long run. They needed something else. They needed a different kind of warfare. "Captain, our systems are barely holding," Harrow said, her voice tight with strain. "They're adapting faster than we can compensate. Our chances of surviving another direct confrontation are slim." Soren's eyes scanned the bridge. The crew was moving quickly, trying to patch the damage, but the odds were against them. The Caldra had demonstrated their overwhelming advantage once again, but Soren wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. Not after the cost of their first battle. "Then we need to change the game," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Deploy the shadow units." Harrow looked up, her brows furrowing. "Are you sure? We don't have the luxury of time, Captain. The Caldra could launch another wave at any moment." "I'm sure," Soren replied. His voice was firm, devoid of hesitation. "We need to hit them where it counts, and that means taking out their infrastructure." Within hours, the shadow units were ready for deployment. These elite teams, trained for infiltration and sabotage, had always been a last resort weapon. They operated in the shadows, using subterfuge and intelligence gathering to cripple enemies from within. Their mission was clear: infiltrate Caldra command facilities and disable their communications, energy systems, and weapons controls. If they could bring down the Caldra's network, they would level the playing field. Soren stood before the team of operatives, his expression grim but determined. "You're our only shot at turning this war around. Get in, get out, and cause as much chaos as you can. The rest of us will keep them distracted." The leader of the shadow units, Captain Mira Talon, gave a short nod, her face unreadable. "Understood, Captain. We'll be in and out before they know we're there." The operation began under the cover of darkness. The vanguard had stealthily maneuvered into the heart of a Caldra staging zone, where the enemy fleet was regrouping after their initial retreat. The shadow units launched from the ship, moving like shadows through the blackness of space, their silent pods docking with an uninhabited Caldra facility orbiting a nearby planet. Mira's team was equipped with everything needed to bypass the Caldra's advanced security. They had cutting-edge hacking tools, custom-built EMP charges, and the silent, swift movements of experienced operatives. Their goal was simple: cripple the Caldra's ability to communicate and coordinate, forcing them into disarray. The first wave was just to get inside. Mira's voice crackled over the comms. "We're in, moving to secondary objective." The team split into smaller squads, each moving to a different sector of the facility. The Caldra had long relied on their superior technological network to monitor and control their empire. If they could take down their communications hubs, it would buy Earth's forces time and shift the balance. Even if only temporarily. The minutes felt like hours as Mira and her team silently moved through the facility, disabling security cameras and cutting power to key sections. Every step was calculated, each move deliberate. They knew the Caldra would be expecting a counterattack, but this would catch them off guard. Meanwhile, back on the vanguard, Soren was pacing, waiting for any sign that the mission was succeeding. Harrow monitored the progress, keeping an eye on the remaining Caldra fleet movements. Every time a new message came through, she checked it twice, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "We've just knocked out their first communications relay," Mira reported over the comms, "shutting down their secure channels now." The sudden shift was noticeable. The Caldra fleet, once moving in synchronized patterns, began to stagger. Signals that had once been sent with laser-quick efficiency were now delayed, erratic. It was working. Mira's team was pulling it off. "We have company," Mira's voice came through, more strained now. "They've noticed the interference. Expect resistance in 15 minutes. Soren's grip tightened around the armrest. "Don't let them regroup. Keep them scattered." The minutes that followed were filled with high-stakes tension. The shadow units had placed EMP charges around the facility, each one designed to cripple the Caldra's internal networks. Mira's team was now working against the clock, planting the final charges, and racing to evacuate before the Caldra could mount a full-scale counterattack. 5 minutes to detonation, Mira's voice crackled through the comms. "We've hit the mainframe, the rest is just icing on the cake." Sovereign's heart raced as he stared at the screen, watching the Caldra ships move, seemingly disoriented. Their once precise maneuvers were starting to unravel. It was as if a fog had descended upon them. Their communication lines were down, and their fleet was no longer working in unison. "Captain," Harrow said suddenly, her voice tight. "We've received an encrypted transmission from Gamma." Soren's eyes snapped to her. "What? Gamma's transmission?" "Wait," Harrow said, her fingers quickly moving across the display. "It's a coded message. It's coming from the Caldra's primary communications relay." Soren's heart skipped. "Gamma?" he muttered under his breath. "Is it them? Or is it the Caldra's trick?" "No, sir, it's Gamma. The transmission confirms their last location before they were wiped out," Hera said, a faint crack of hope in her voice. The Shadow Unit's final move was to set off the EMP charges. As the massive pulse of energy spread across the facility, the Caldra's control systems went dark, and the facility's alarms screamed. "Time to go," Mira called. "Evacuating now." The operatives raced to their extraction point, leaving behind a facility in chaos. The Caldra's communications were broken, their fleet scattered. The mission had been a success. Back aboard the Vanguard, Soren leaned back in his chair, his breath coming faster now, a sense of cautious optimism filling the bridge. Harrow glanced at him, a small smile on her face. "Captain, the Caldra are scrambling. They have no idea what just happened." Soren allowed himself a moment of relief. For the first time since the war had started, he saw a glimmer of hope. The Shadow Units had given humanity the edge. But Soren knew it was only a momentary victory. The Caldra would recover. Of that, he was certain. But for now, humanity had a chance. And with that chance, Soren would push forward, one calculated move at a time. "Keep up the pressure," Soren ordered, his voice steady once again. "This is just the beginning." The crew nodded, knowing they had a long road ahead of them, but for now they had gained a crucial advantage. And Soren was determined not to waste it. Soren's breath caught in his chest as the transmission cut off. For a moment, there was only the eerie quiet of the Vanguard's bridge. The crew frozen in place as the implications of the message settled in. The Shadow Units had succeeded. Yet the enemy had already begun to retaliate. A new transmission, this time from Harrow, broke the silence. "Captain, the Caldra are mobilizing again. Their reinforcements have arrived. They're coming for us, and they're not holding back." Soren stood, every muscle in his body tight with the realization that the Caldra's response was coming faster than they could react. This wasn't just a counterattack. It was a full-on assault. Their earlier victories, the disruptions, the sabotage, it had all been for this moment. The Caldra were about to show them just how much more power they had at their disposal. "Move the fleet into defensive positions," Soren ordered. "Harrow, give me a scan. Let's see how much damage we've done." Harrow's fingers flew over the console as the screen in front of them flickered to life. The Caldra fleet had rallied and was now advancing with renewed intensity. Their ships, larger, more advanced, emerged from the depths of space like a wave, dark and menacing. "They've got reinforcements. A new fleet, larger than expected," Harrow reported, her voice strained. "Their ships are powering up. This isn't just a skirmish. They're coming for us." Soren clenched his fists. "We've hurt them. But it's not enough. We need to hold them off long enough to regroup." A loud explosion echoed through the ship, rattling the bridge. Soren's eyes snapped toward the damage reports on the heads-up display. The Vanguard had taken a hit. Its shields buckling under the pressure. The Caldra had adapted quicker than he anticipated. "Status report," Soren barked. "We're holding, Captain," Darnell said, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. "But if this keeps up, we won't last. They're moving in too fast." Soren's mind raced. He had to make a decision, one that would shape the course of the war. Their fleet was in danger, and the Caldra weren't pulling any punches. The battle was escalating, and with every moment, the chances of survival dwindled. "We need to turn the tide," Soren muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Darnell, take command of the fleet. Harrow, get me a direct link to the Shadow Units." As the bridge crew scrambled to execute the order, Soren's mind was focused on one thing: survival. But survival meant more than just holding on. It meant fighting back, using every last ounce of human ingenuity to challenge the overwhelming power of the Keldra. The heads-up display flashed a warning, signaling an incoming missile barrage. Soren's breath caught in his throat as the countdown clock ticked away in the corner of his vision. He had no choice but to act. Evasive maneuvers, he ordered. Harold, take us to the asteroid field. We'll use the terrain to shield us. The Vanguard's engines roared to life as the ship veered sharply to the side, narrowly avoiding the incoming salvo. The Keldra fleet, relentless in their assault, didn't back off. Instead, they closed in, their ships moving with military precision. We can't keep this up for long, Darnell said, his eyes glued to the strategic display. The longer we engage, the more we risk losing. Soren's mind raced. The Keldra were making it clear they wanted to finish this, and the odds were stacked against them. We won't outfight them head-on, Soren said, a grim resolution settling over him. But we can't outthink them. Get the drones ready. We're going to sabotage their command ship. Harrow's fingers moved quickly over the console. You want to go in that close? Do we have a choice? Soren asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Get the drones prepped. We're going to hit them where it hurts. The Vanguard crept into position, staying within the shadow of the asteroid belt. Soren knew they were running out of time. The Keldra ships were closing in, their weapons primed for another devastating strike. But the Vanguard wasn't going to give up without a fight. We've deployed the drones, Harrow reported. They'll infiltrate the enemy command ship in 2 minutes. Soren leaned forward, watching the drone trajectory on the screen. The drones were small, stealthy, and packed with EMP devices designed to disrupt the Keldra's central systems. They had one chance to disable the command ship before the Keldra realized what was happening. Keep those shields up, Harrow, Soren said, his voice low. We need to make sure they don't catch on before it's too late. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The drones were now within range, skimming the edges of the Keldra fleet. The battle raged around them, but Soren remained focused, his mind zeroed in on the target. And then it happened. The first sign of success came in the form of a Keldra command ship faltering, its weapons systems going dark. The Keldra fleet stumbled for a moment, disoriented. Soren didn't hesitate. Now, he shouted, move in, hit them hard. The Vanguard surged forward, weapons blazing. The Keldra ship scrambled to regain control, but it was too late. The drones had done their work, and for a brief, shining moment, the tide of the battle shifted. But the Keldra were not so easily beaten. Within seconds, the remaining Keldra ships adjusted, retaliating with new tactics, more advanced than anything Soren had encountered. A barrage of energy blasts tore through the void, slamming into the Vanguard's shields, causing the ship to lurch violently. Shields failing, Darnell shouted. Soren gritted his teeth. They had struck a blow, but the Keldra were relentless. They would not give up so easily. Prepare for impact, Soren ordered, his mind sharp. Brace yourselves. We're not running away. The Vanguard shuddered under the force of the next attack, but Soren stood firm. The battle was far from over. The crew was scattered, trying to maintain control of the ship's failing systems. But Soren knew one thing for certain. They couldn't keep this up much longer. The Keldra were closing in fast, and their ships were more powerful than ever. Soren turned to Darnell, his expression hardening. We've done enough damage, we need to fall back and regroup. Prepare for a strategic withdrawal. Darnell nodded, his expression grim. It's going to be close, Captain. We're taking heavy losses. Soren looked out at the battlefield, his thoughts a tangled mess of anger and resolve. He had never wanted this, never wanted to give up. But sometimes, survival meant making the hard call. And now, he had to make the hardest decision of all. To retreat, to preserve what was left of humanity's fleet, and to live to fight another day. Get us out of here, Soren said, his voice low but unyielding. As the Vanguard turned away from the battlefield, the crew moved quickly, their minds focused on the next steps. The battle was over, for now. But the war was far from won. The battle had raged for weeks. Every victory felt hollow, every retreat heavier than the last. Sauron stood before the tactical display, staring at the glowing red map of the Caldra's vast holdings. The Caldra fleet was formidable, but it was the Caldra manufacturing planet, Echor, that had kept their war machine running at full capacity. If they could destroy that, they would cripple the enemy's ability to replenish their forces. The thought of the Caldra suffering the same depletion they had imposed on humanity was a cold comfort, but it was the only chance they had left. "We can't keep up the fight at this pace," Darnell said, his voice low, filled with concern. He had never been one to shy away from a fight, but even he knew the situation was dire. "We need a definitive strike, something that'll shake them to their core." Sauron turned from the screen, his eyes hard. "We take out their supply line, we target Echor." Garrow's eyes flicked to Sauron, her expression unreadable. "The planet's heavily fortified. It's a suicide mission, Captain. They've got defenses that make our fleet look like children's toys." Sauron didn't flinch. He knew the risks. "We don't have the luxury of time. If we don't act now, we lose. If we hit them hard enough, they won't recover in time to retaliate." Darnell clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "Then, it's settled. We'll need everything we've got. Full assault, no second chances." The plan was simple, if brutal. Infiltrate the Caldra defenses with a combination of stealth tactics and direct firepower. They would deploy sabotage teams to plant explosives deep inside the planet's main manufacturing facilities, while the fleet kept the Caldra fleet distracted. The operation required precision. Too much time spent in the area and the Caldra would retaliate with overwhelming force. Sauron stood over the final battle plan, eyes scanning the screen. The target was set. The vanguard would lead the assault, with the remaining fleet in tow. They would breach Echor's atmosphere, plant the charges, and get out. The timing had to be perfect. Every piece of the puzzle had to fall into place. "I want every available ship prepped and ready," Sauron ordered. "This is our only shot." Hours later, they were in position. The fleet hovered on the edge of the Caldra system, waiting for the signal to engage. The tension on the bridge was palpable. Harrow's fingers hovered over the controls, ready to execute the final move. The Caldra fleet had positioned themselves in orbit around Echor, forming a wall of ships that could cut off any approach. The vanguard and its support ships would need to push through with everything they had. Sauron's mind was clear, he had made the call, and now there was no turning back. "Launch the infiltration team," he said, his voice calm. "Deploy the drones and prepare for the initial bombardment." Hera's fingers moved quickly over the controls, sending the first wave of drones into the atmosphere. The small craft would carve their way through the Caldra's defenses, making way for the larger assault team. The drones would disable key defense systems, allowing the fleet to move in. As the first drone reports came in, Sauron could see that the operation was going as planned, but time was slipping away. "Captain, the Caldra are adapting faster than we expected," Harrow said. "Their defensive shields are starting to come back online." Sauron's jaw tightened. "Don't let them recover. Hit them with everything we've got." The fleet surged forward, weapons primed. The first barrage of missiles cut through the dark sky, striking the Caldra defenses with brutal force. The Caldra retaliated immediately, their ships firing back with precision. Explosions lit up the void, and the vanguard rocked from the impact of a direct hit. "Shields at 30%, Darnell shouted, gripping the control panel. "We're taking too much fire." "Keep going," Sauron ordered, his voice unwavering. "We've come too far to back down now." The vanguard pushed deeper into the Caldra defenses, the remaining fleet following closely behind. The sound of energy blasts and exploding ships filled the air, each strike leaving a trail of debris in its wake. On the surface, Echor's main manufacturing complex loomed large, and the shadow units were already in position to plant the explosives. Inside the facility, Mira's team moved quickly, bypassing security and slipping past guards undetected. The Caldra had underestimated the human ability to adapt, to fight in the shadows. The sabotage team had made it inside, and now it was time to make their move. Mira's eyes scanned the terminal in front of her as she began planting the last of the charges. The Caldra would never know what hit them. "Charge complete," Mira whispered into the comms. "We're set. Get ready to get out." Back on the Vanguard, Soren's pulse quickened as the timer ticked down. The explosives were in place, and now it was a waiting game. But the Caldra weren't done yet. Their fleet continued to push back, retaliating with everything they had. "We're being surrounded, Captain," Darnell reported, his voice tense. "The Caldra are massing their ships. They're trying to trap us in the atmosphere." Soren's gaze locked on the tactical display. The Caldra had seen through their plan, and now they were about to pay for it. "Prepare to break free. Harrow, give me a vector for the closest exit." Harrow's hands flew across the console as she plotted their escape route. "We're going to need a few minutes, Captain. We're taking too much fire from all sides." Soren's hand tightened on the armrest, his mind racing. The plan was in motion, but the cost was mounting. He had sent his people into the heart of the Caldra's defenses, and they were taking heavy losses. But there was no room for second-guessing. "Do it," he said, his voice low. "Get us out of here." The ship jolted as the remaining missiles struck the Vanguard, but Soren didn't flinch. He had no time for fear. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching. The ship's engines roared to life as Harrow executed the evasive maneuver, cutting through the Caldra fleet with a sharp turn. The Vanguard broke free from the surrounding fleet, but the cost was clear. Many ships didn't make it. Explosions tore through the air as the remaining fleet scrambled to retreat. "Captain," Darnell said, his voice heavy with the weight of what they had just done, "we've lost a third of our fleet." Soren's eyes flickered across the reports. The destruction of Echor would cripple the Caldra, but humanity had paid a heavy price. The survivors were few, and the battle was far from over. The firestorm of the destroyed planet lit up the space behind them as they made their escape. Soren stood in silence, feeling the weight of their sacrifice. There had been no easy choice, no clean victory. The Caldra had been wounded, but humanity had bled for it. "We've won this round," Soren muttered under his breath, his hand clenched tightly around the armrest. "But it's not over." As the Vanguard fled into the distance, the crew's eyes were haunted by the cost of the victory. The war was far from finished, and Soren knew that this was only the beginning. But they had struck a blow, and that was enough. For now, the victory at Echor had been short-lived. Despite the crippling blow humanity had dealt the Caldra, the enemy's response came with ferocity. Earth, so recently liberated from the threat of total annihilation, now found itself on the precipice of the final battle. The Caldra fleet, vast and brutal, had reassembled. The Caldra had learned from their mistakes, and now they were coming for Earth itself. "Captain, the Caldra have launched their final assault." Harrow's voice was steady, but beneath it the tension was unmistakable. "They're massing their forces outside Earth's orbit. It's all or nothing." Soren's gaze swept across the bridge. The crew, though battle-worn, remained focused. They knew what was coming. Humanity's last stand was upon them. There was no retreat. The cost of failure was unimaginable. Soren turned to face Darnell, his mind working furiously. "We don't have the firepower to match them head-on. What options do we have?" Darnell didn't miss a beat. "We use what we have. They're expecting another full-on engagement. We use deception, sabotage, and everything in between. If we can disrupt their systems long enough, we might just have a shot." Soren nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we fight dirty, no honor, no rules. Get the rest of the fleet in position. We're going to make them regret underestimating humanity." The atmosphere on the Vanguard was tense. The bridge, though still operational, had its share of scars from the last few battles. Harrow's fingers flew over the console, keeping an eye on the Caldra fleet's movements as it grew closer to Earth. The main heads-up display flickered briefly before a map of the solar system materialized. The Caldra fleet had spread out, encircling Earth. They were moving in slowly, strategically, as if savoring the impending destruction. Soren felt his chest tighten. It wasn't just a final assault, it was a statement. The Caldra were here to finish what they started. "We've got maybe an hour before they reach Earth's atmosphere," Harrow said. "The fleet is moving in, and their weapons are primed." Soren turned to the tactical display, his mind racing. We have to buy time. Harrow, prepare the decoy drones. Darnell, coordinate the sabotage units. Everyone else, get ready for combat. As the crew scrambled to follow orders, Soren stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the stars outside. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect on how far they had come. This fight, this desperate final push, had come at such a high cost, and yet, here they were, still standing, still fighting. The battle started with a violent bang. The Caldra launched their first wave of attack. The Vanguard shook as energy blasts tore through the outer hull. The lights flickered, and the ship groaned under the strain of the assault. The rest of the fleet, though damaged, rallied around the Vanguard, preparing for the inevitable. "We're going to need to draw them in," Darnell called out. "If we don't, we'll get picked off one by one." Soren nodded. "I'll lead the charge. Stay close, Darnell. We need to hit them fast and hard." The Vanguard surged forward, its engines roaring as it cut through the void. The Caldra, expecting a more calculated approach, seemed unprepared for the sheer audacity of the human response. As the ships exchanged fire, humanity's fleet used the asteroid fields as cover, darting in and out with surprising speed. But the Caldra weren't foolish. They quickly adjusted, countering with their superior weaponry. A wave of explosions erupted around them as the Caldra's retaliation came swift and brutal. One of the supporting ships in the fleet was struck and torn apart, debris floating in the darkness of space. The loss was staggering, but there was no time to mourn. The remaining ships pressed on. On the Vanguard, the damage reports kept coming. The shields were holding for now, but just barely. The Caldra had concentrated their firepower, focusing all their energy on the Vanguard, attempting to break the last bastion of human resistance. "Shields at 25%, Harrow called out, her voice laced with urgency. "We can't take much more of this." Soren's face hardened as he looked at the tactical display. Earth was only moments away from the Caldra's full assault. He turned to Darnell. "We have one last chance. If we don't take out their command ship, they'll wipe us out." Darnell met his gaze, his expression resolute. "Let's hit them where it hurts." The Vanguard surged forward once again, this time targeting the Caldra's lead command ship. A series of well-placed missiles streaked toward the Caldra ship, but they were met with defensive shields. A few slipped through, causing some visible damage, but it wasn't enough to slow the Caldra's momentum. Soren knew they had to do more. He activated the decoy drones, small, agile craft designed to confuse enemy sensors and disrupt targeting systems. The drones zipped into the Caldra fleet, creating a chaotic burst of interference. "We've got their attention," Harold reported, "but they're adapting quickly. They're focusing fire on the drones now." Soren watched as the drones danced through the fleet, knowing this was their final gambit. The Caldra, distracted by the drones, were leaving themselves open for a brief moment. "Now," Soren shouted, "full assault on the command ship." The remaining fleet surged forward, its weapons blazing. The Vanguard pushed ahead, its weapon systems firing relentlessly at the Caldra command ship. The blasts tore through the Caldra vessel's shields, forcing the ship to stagger back as its power systems began to fail. "We're in range," Darnell reported. "Prepare to fire the main cannons." The Vanguard's main guns lit up with a brilliant flash as the barrage of firepower hammered into the Caldra command ship. The enemy vessel, once pristine and imposing, began to break apart, its core destabilizing. The Caldra fleet, now thrown into chaos, started to retreat. But it was too late. The explosion was deafening even from a distance. The Caldra command ship erupted in a fiery ball of destruction, the shockwave rippling through the space around it. For a brief moment it looked like victory was within reach. But the cost was evident. Several ships in the human fleet were no longer operational, reduced to floating debris in the aftermath of the battle. Soren watched as the debris from the Caldra fleet scattered across the space around Earth. The battle had been won, but the price was steep. He could feel the weight of the loss in his chest. The sacrifices made today were unimaginable. And while the Caldra had been dealt a significant blow, humanity had paid a high price. As the final remnants of the Caldra fleet retreated, Soren stood at the viewport, staring out at the vastness of space. The battle had been won, but at what cost? Earth was safe, for now. The fires of the war were far from extinguished. We did it, Harrow said softly, as if speaking the words to herself. Soren nodded, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. We fought, and we survived. Humanity had won today, but the war was far from over. And Soren knew that with Earth's future hanging in the balance, this was just one chapter in the story of their survival. The Caldra fleet was retreating, their once imposing warships scattered across the cosmos, a shadow of their former strength. Earth had won, but the victory felt hollow. The silence that followed the battle was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that had raged just hours before. Soren stood at the edge of the Vanguard's command deck, gazing out at the remnants of the Caldra fleet, drifting away into the distance. The fires of battle had been extinguished, but a different kind of fire burned in his chest. The war was over, but at what cost? Captain, we're receiving reports from Earth. Hera's voice cut through his thoughts. The Caldra are retreating, but they've left significant damage in their wake. The aftermath is going to be more complicated than we thought. Soren didn't respond immediately. He watched as the stars beyond the viewport stretched out, peaceful and still, a cruel contrast to the chaos they had just endured. The Earth he had fought to protect now stood on the edge of a new beginning. But the scars of war were visible everywhere. The planet was alive, but its people were broken. The crew, exhausted but relieved, moved in quiet, purposeful motions around him. The sound of footsteps and the clicking of consoles filled the air, but there was no celebration, no cheers. They had all seen too much, lost too much, to revel in victory. Have we heard from the other fleets? Soren asked, turning back to face Harrow. Most of them are in recovery mode, she replied. The damage is severe, Captain. It'll take time to rebuild, and we've lost many good men and women. The task ahead of us is monumental. Soren nodded, feeling the weight of every word she said. The battle had been won, but the war, in its aftermath, had become something else entirely. It was no longer about defeating the Caldra. It was about picking up the pieces of a broken world. As the Vanguard made its way toward Earth, Soren's mind lingered on the faces of those who had fallen. The soldiers, the engineers, the civilians. Each one lost in the fight for survival. They had given everything, and now it was up to him and the surviving crew to ensure that their sacrifices were not in vain. The journey back to Earth was a quiet one. The usual chatter on the bridge had been replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional report or the hum of the ship's systems. Soren couldn't bring himself to engage in the small talk that normally filled these moments. There was no joy in survival. Not after what they had been through. Once the Vanguard entered Earth's orbit, the crew began preparations for docking. The planet below was scarred but resilient. Cities lay in ruins and entire populations had been displaced. But the world still turned. Earth was still there. Soren stepped off the ship and into the makeshift command center set up near the planet's surface. A few high-ranking officials from the global coalition were already there, ready to begin the long process of recovery. But Soren didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a leader. He felt the weight of every life lost, every decision made, and every face he would never see again. The room was filled with the quiet murmur of strategic discussions. Harrow, Darnell, and a few others stood nearby, discussing the next steps. But Soren's mind wasn't on the plans for recovery. It was on the faces of the fallen, on the people who had believed in them, trusted them, only to be lost to the fires of war. He walked to a corner of the room, his gaze falling to a map of the war zones. Earth's fractured territories with pockets of resistance still struggling to survive. The war was technically over, but the damage to the world and its people would take years to undo. The Earth he had fought to protect now lay in ruins. and he had been the one to lead them into this chaos. "Sir," Darnell said, approaching him, "the rebuilding efforts are underway. We're going to need everyone we can get to help stabilize the planet." Soren turned to face Darnell, his expression unreadable. "And if we can't stabilize it?" "We will," Darnell said firmly. "But it's going to take time. The infrastructure is shattered, and there's still tension between some of the factions. But we've made it this far. We can rebuild." Soren let out a breath, his gaze drifting back to the map. "It's not just about rebuilding cities or systems, Darnell. It's about rebuilding trust. The people won't forget what happened here. How do you heal that?" Darnell didn't answer immediately. He could see the conflict in Soren's eyes, the burden of leadership, the weight of the decisions made. They had won the war, but the victory felt too thin, too fragile. "Maybe we don't need to heal it," Darnell said finally. "Maybe we just have to live up to it. Show them we can move forward." Soren nodded, though the weight of the responsibility pressed heavily on him. "I hope you're right." Days turned into weeks as the Vanguard and its fleet worked to assist in Earth's recovery efforts. The task was overwhelming, and the emotional toll on Soren and his crew was immense. There were constant reports of lost colonies, families displaced, and the ongoing fallout from the war. But slowly, the world began to stir, to rebuild. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. Soren found himself in constant meetings, helping coordinate the rebuilding efforts. He was there when new leadership emerged, working with governments, military factions, and civilian groups to unite under one cause: rebuilding Earth. There was no time to dwell on the past. The future demanded their attention. But Soren couldn't shake the guilt. Every time he saw a face in the crowd, every time he met someone new, he saw the cost of their victory. The empty seats at the table, the lives that had been extinguished so quickly. He had been their leader, and he had led them to victory. But that victory had been built on blood. "Captain," Harrow's voice broke through his thoughts. "You've been working non-stop for weeks. You need to rest." Soren didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. There was always something more to do, someone else to help. The weight of the responsibility was crushing. "I'll rest when we've finished," he said finally, his voice strained. "When we've rebuilt." Harrow gave him a small, knowing smile. "You're not alone in this, Captain. We're all in this together. You've done everything you could. Now, it's time for us all to do our part." Soren's gaze softened as he looked out at the bustling command center. The world wasn't healed, but it was on the mend. And for the first time in weeks, Soren allowed himself to hope. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more challenges, but humanity had survived. And with that, they had a chance to rebuild not just their cities, but their future. He allowed himself a single moment of peace before the next battle began. For now, Earth was safe, and that was enough. The silence that had once hung like a weight on Earth now felt different. It wasn't the silence of defeat, but the quiet after a battle. The stillness before the dawn of something new. The Caldra were gone. Their fleet scattered and humanity had emerged, battered but resolute. Soren stood on the balcony of the command center, looking out at the planet below. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the broken cities, now in the midst of rebuilding. The scars were everywhere, but so was the strength to rise again. For a long time, Soren had thought that victory meant the end of the fight. That once the enemy was defeated, the world would go back to normal. He had thought that peace was something that could be won with a battle. But now, standing here, he understood something deeper. Peace was not an end. It was a new beginning, one that came with its own challenges, its own cost. Harrow's voice broke through his thoughts. "The Council is waiting for you. They need your input on the next phase of reconstruction." Soren turned slowly, taking one last look at the horizon before stepping back into the room. He had always been a soldier, a commander. Leading had come naturally, but it was leadership now, in the aftermath of the war, that tested him. It wasn't about tactics anymore. It was about hope, about the future. We're stronger now, he said, softly, almost to himself. But it's going to take more than just military strength to rebuild. We need unity. We need to remember what we fought for. Agreed, Harrow said, her voice steady. But we can't ignore the political divisions. Not all factions are on the same page about the future. Some are still holding on to the old ways. Soren nodded. He knew this battle hadn't ended with the Kaldra's retreat. It was just the beginning of the next one. Then we'll remind them what they fought for, too. They didn't just lose soldiers. They lost everything. Earth didn't fight for borders or resources. We fought for a future. The council chamber was filled with the world's leaders, a hodgepodge of weary faces who had survived the unthinkable. The room buzzed with a tense energy. Soren stepped in, flanked by Darnell and Harrow, and took his place at the head of the table. We're here to discuss the future, Soren began, his voice cutting through the noise. But let's not forget the cost of our survival. The Kaldra are gone, but they aren't the only threat out there. The galaxy has seen humanity's resolve. We've earned our place in it. The room fell silent. The people around the table knew what was at stake. They had all seen it, watched the destruction, felt the weight of each decision, and lived through the aftermath. But there was something else, too. A quiet pride. A recognition that humanity had proven itself capable of surviving in a galaxy full of far more dangerous forces. Earth is stronger than ever, Soren continued, his gaze steady, resolute. But that strength will only last if we stand together. We can't afford to fracture now, not when the future is waiting for us. We have to build not just our cities, but our unity. We have to show the universe that humanity will not be erased. We will not fall. Not today, not ever. The council members exchanged looks, nodding slowly. They had seen the cost. They had seen the strength of humanity. And now, they were ready to see that strength used to forge something new. Later that day, as Soren stood on the command deck, the first official communication from the Galactic Council came through. The message was short, but powerful. Earth had earned its place among the stars. For the first time, Soren allowed himself to feel the weight of that victory. It wasn't just the defeat of the Kaldra, the destruction of their fleet, or the long, hard battles fought in space. It was the realization that Earth, once considered weak, had stood up to a galactic empire, had faced down extinction, and had emerged victorious. Humanity had proven something that the galaxy would never forget: the strength to fight, to adapt, to survive. And now, it was time to rise, not just as survivors, but as a force to be reckoned with. Captain, Earth's place in the galactic order is secure, Harrow said, her voice filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The message has been received. Soren nodded, though his mind was already moving ahead. Now we rebuild. Now we make sure this never happens again. We can't afford to rest on our laurels. The galaxy is vast, and there are others out there who will test us. Darnell, who had been standing quietly by, turned toward him. But we've shown them who we are. We're not just another target. We're humanity, and we're ready to stand with anyone who believes in the same future. Soren's eyes flicked to the window, where the stars stretched out before him. For the first time in a long while, he felt something like hope. Not the naive, fleeting kind, but the kind built on the bones of those who had fallen, on the blood and sacrifice that had made this day possible. The vanguard had brought them this far, but Soren knew it was humanity itself that had secured their place in the galaxy. It wasn't just the fleet, the weapons, or the strategies that had carried them through. It was their will, their unwavering defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. As he looked at Earth below, a quiet pride settled in his chest. This isn't just about survival anymore, he said, more to himself than anyone else. It's about creating the future we fought for. The next morning, as the sun rose over Earth, Soren stood once more at the viewport, watching the familiar blue and green of the planet below. The scars of war were still visible, but the cracks in the surface were healing. Humanity had been tested, but it had come through stronger. The destruction, the loss. It had all led to this moment, the moment when humanity stood on the precipice of a new era. The future was theirs to shape. And though the road ahead would be difficult, Sauron knew one thing. Humanity would never back down. Not from the Caldra, not from any other enemy that dared to challenge them. Because Earth was no longer just a vulnerable planet in the dark. It was a force to be reckoned with. Humanity is no longer an underdog, Sauron whispered to himself, his voice firm with the weight of the realization. We are the future. And as the Earth flag flew high in the sky, waves of hope and determination spreading across the globe, Sauron felt something inside him shift. The story of Earth's survival wasn't just about one battle. It was about a people's unbroken will to live, to grow, to fight for their place in the stars. Humanity had faced the impossible and had emerged victorious. And now, the galaxy would remember the name Earth. Humanity fought, survived, and emerged stronger than ever. The galaxy will never forget our resolve. If you believe in the strength of the human spirit, hit like, share this story, and subscribe for more. Join us as we continue to rise, ready to face any challenge that lies ahead. The future is ours.